Good evening. This isn't the kind of story people usually share, but since you're here, let me tell you about a neighbor who was once trusted and about a truth that should have been seen sooner. I'm going to tell this in one line from start to finish, the way it sits in my head when I can't sleep, without chapters or clever breaks. If you're the kind of person who likes to pause and decide where the story ends, that's fine, but for me, there isn't a clean hedge. It still runs. I grew up on a dead-end street where everyone knew the sound of your car coming home. Our town sat between fields and freeway, a place people stopped for gas and forgot 15 minutes later. Summer smelled like hot tar and cut grass. In the evenings, porch lights came on one by one like a row of blinking eyes. 2 doors down from us lived a man everyone called Mr. Howland. He had the big maple, the tidy hedge, the porch swing that sighed every time he shifted his weight. He wore the same faded cap, winter and summer, and kept a radio tuned to a ball game so low you had to lean in to tell who was winning. He was the sort of neighbor people trusted with spare keys and deliveries when they were out of town. I don't remember anyone ever asking him for anything he didn't do. He liked to talk, but not about himself. He talked about crops he didn't plant and teams he didn't play on, and sometimes about his father. He said his father had been a police officer in the next county back when training was a handshake and paperwork was a shoebox. He told those stories slowly, always in daylight, always with the radio low, his voice steady in the way of someone setting down a load they've carried a long time. The one he told most went like this. When he was a boy, about my age then, his father got called to a trailer way out near the county line. It was the kind of place that looks temporary and ends up permanent. A little box of a life, where nobody stops by unless the power goes out or there's a reason. His mother was away visiting her sister. There was no one to leave the boy with. His father told him to get his shoes and not to make a sound. He described the drive like it wasn't just a road, but a tunnel cut through night. No streetlights, gravel knocking the underside of the car, fields flat and black to both sides. He said they arrived to see 2 sheriff's cars nosed into the grass, their red bars dark, men with flashlights moving slowly, no sirens and no one talking. That's how you knew, he always said, when men who like to use their voices decide not to. His father told him to stay in the car, locked, head down. He meant it. He always meant what he said. The boy waited about as long as any boy would, and then opened the door, quiet, and stood with the metal cool against his back. He never gave me the word people like to use for traffic. He didn't need to. He described a door open onto too much dark, newspapers on a floor that had never been swept, a smell like pennies left on a heater, and a table that didn't belong in a kitchen. He said a man stood there in an apron that might have once been white, holding a knife the way your father might hold one while cutting steak on Sunday, not raised, not threatening, just there. When the lights hit him, he did something the boy never forgot. He nodded. Not the nod of hello and not surrender, just a nod, like people had arrived at the time they were supposed to and he was ready to be done. Later, after I was older, he did add one word, always in the same tone you use for weather or taxes. He said there were pieces. He didn't list them then. He just let the idea sit until it grew teeth. It was the way he always ended that story that stuck to me. He looked like anyone, he'd say, and adjust his cap, and the swing would creak. He looked like a man you'd ask to hold your ladder. Then he would change the subject, ask me about school, ask about my mother's dog, pass me a soda from the cooler he kept under the swing. He never told it at night. He never made it
a campfire tale. He told it like a man who wanted to take something poisonous and fix it to the ground with pins so it couldn't run. As I got older, the story didn't change, but the pauses did. He would catch in the same places, like his mind had potholes only he could see. He lived alone. People said he had once almost left, almost married, almost moved west to be near a brother, almost sold the house. Almost. The porch and the maple's roots had the same opinion about that. Some things are meant to stay.
I was 14 when he first asked me to help him carry something. It was late summer, the kind of heat that makes window screens sing with insects. He called from his porch, "Mind giving me a hand in the basement? Old freezer's being stubborn." I said sure, because you don't say no to a neighbor like that. I told my mother where I was going. She looked up from rinsing strawberries and said, "Be back in 20, the way mothers say an exact number to make a bargain with their own worry. I walked over, and he held the door for me and thanked me like I'd done more than bring him his mail when he was sick. I'd been in his house before, but never past the kitchen. It was spare in the way you get when you've lived with the same walls so long there's nothing left to prove. Clean counters, old calendar, a corkboard with rubber bands looped around pins. The basement door opened onto a wooden staircase with a bare bulb at the top that made everything below look like water. He went first with a flashlight, his free hand on the rail. The steps answered each foot like a question. Down there, it was cool and dry, the way he liked to brag basements ought to be, if a house was built right. The light showed a workbench with tools set out in unnerving order, a laundry sink, shelves with jars that held screws and nails and buttons and string. At the back wall, a chest freezer sat on a piece of plywood. A padlock hung from the latch, but wasn't snapped shut, just resting there like a belt threaded through loops and left. He told me to grab the far end while he tipped it to slide a folded towel under the front leg. "Leveling," he said, and grinned like we were in on a trick together. We shuffled the thing an inch at a time, scraping plywood on concrete. It was heavier than any freezer I'd moved, which wasn't many, but enough to know. Sweat ran down my back in the cold air. He watched my hands like he was waiting for me to get it wrong. When we had it wedged how he wanted it, he straightened and took a breath, and then, casual as setting down a grocery list, he said, "Want to see why it needs to stay cold?" I remember the small sound my throat made, the bulb humming overhead, the ache in my palms. He hooked a finger under the padlock, swung it, lifted the lid a few inches, and a sheet of white fog rose like breath. I saw plastic. I saw labels with dates. I saw something the size and shape of a roast in butcher paper. He held the lid there, not enough for me to study anything, but enough to make my heart punch my ribs. Then from high and far away in the world of dinner and dishes and normal, my mother called my name from our porch, like the house itself had decided to speak. He let the lid down easy and laughed, like I'd told a joke. "You better go," he said, amiable, an old man amused by an old story. "Tell your mom she makes a mean strawberry shortcake." He followed me up the steps, his hand light on my shoulder like he was guiding me around a hazard I couldn't see. At the door, he thanked me again. Back on the sidewalk, the air hit me like a wave. I realized I'd been holding my breath. Nothing happened that night.
I ate strawberries and shortcake and watched a show with my mother and pretended not to replay the picture of plastic and paper. For a while, I told myself it was venison or pork bought on sale or just the ordinary stash of a man who liked to cook ahead. If you've spent any time truly scaring yourself, you know how good the mind is at building safe houses where there aren't any. It puts curtains in the windows and invites you to sit down. I sat.
A month later, a girl went missing. She was 11. From 3 blocks over, a face I recognized from the bus stop and the fall carnival. That soft age where kids are still children from the right angle and suddenly older from another. The afternoon she didn't come home, we heard what every neighborhood hears before it knows it's hearing it. A mother's voice, getting louder as if volume can reach farther into time. Street by street, boys and girls never good at being home on time showed up in doorways, breathless and annoyed at being treated like suspects. She didn't. The sun went down and the street lights came on and people started standing on their porches in pairs, not for conversation, but so they could tell themselves they were doing something. Flashlights appeared because flashlights make people feel potent. Police cars cruised slow and turned and cruised back. My mother said her name out loud the way you say a prayer you haven't practiced in years.
If your town has ever held its breath together, you know how the days afterward move. Flyers on poles, volunteers with maps, rumor folding into rumor until you can't remember where you heard anything first. People who usually say, "It can't happen here," learned the trick of saying nothing at all. The police did what police do in a place that still believes they are the only line. Door to door, questions packaged in patient voices, a request to look around basements and sheds, most everyone saying yes, as if the word could be armor. For the first time since I was a kid, I saw officers I didn't know by name. The county came, the state maybe. We started wearing our good clothes to the grocery because we were afraid the story would take a picture of us in the wrong shirt. I didn't go to Mr. Howland's house that week. I didn't need to see him. He was on his porch most afternoons watching us watch each other. He'd nod when anyone passed and keep the radio low. He put 2 extra chairs out like he was inviting company, and nobody took the offer. I told myself I was being childish. I told myself lots of people have freezers with meat and labels. Hunting season had just passed. I told myself the smell I remembered from last winter, that dark, sweet wrongness, could have been anything. I didn't believe me.
When the police came to our door, they were polite. They always are on a street like ours, where folks vote and pay and feel like being asked is a compliment to their citizenship. They stood on the porch and asked if they could check the garage and the shed and the basement. My mother said, of course. They looked with careful faces. They thanked us and left. I watched their car roll to the end of the street. They turned around in the cul-de-sac and stopped in front of the house with the maple. I wish I could tell you I had a pure thought in that moment, some bell of certainty that rang in my ribs. The truth is uglier and smaller. I thought of the basement steps, and the bulb, and the fog rising, and the way his hand had rested on my shoulder as we came up. I thought of the newspaper on the table in his father's story, the specific calm of a man who doesn't see a need to hurry. I thought of the way he told that story only in daylight, as if night had a right to claim its own. They were at his door for a long time. Nobody on our street is rude enough to stand and stare, but we became very interested in our hedges and mailboxes. He let them in, He let everyone in. He was like that. He believed in being helpful because helpful men don't get accused. His porch light came on early, as if the day had shortened itself from shame. He didn't come back out.
I don't know what they saw first. I know some of the officers came up, pale, and went to their cars, and sat in the front seats with their hands on the wheel, in the way men do when the ground shifts under them and they need the fiction of control. I know someone brought in a large plastic tub and left without it. The words the chief used on the curb for the cameras that gathered before dinner were careful and perfectly useless. Materials of interest. Items requiring analysis. A scene consistent with a broader investigation. None of us needed the nouns he didn't say. The girl's face looked out from 100 printouts taped to poles that didn't hold her up at all.
What we learned a piece at a time over weeks. Some from papers and some from men who can't help talking too loud in diner booths. The basement was clean. That was one of the first things everyone agreed about. Not neat like a grandmother's pantry. Clean like a kitchen that expects inspection. On the shelves, rows of jars with labels that only said dates. In the corner, a notebook that some called a ledger and some called a list, and none of them called what it was to us once we heard. Columns of times and weights. The same neat hand over and over, going back years. No names, no places, no explanations beyond the terrible clarity of order. The freezer held packages wrapped in plastic and lined in more plastic. They were sealed like they mattered to someone. Some were bones, human bones, the kind that don't belong to livestock and don't come in a butcher's case. Ball joints and finger lengths and a radius you wouldn't mistake for anything else if you'd ever held an arm. Some were smaller and worse in their smallness. One officer putting a hand on his stomach near the squad car told another to stop talking, and then didn't. They found a second freezer in the garage behind a row of rakes. It was older, the sort of beige that used to be white. It had fewer packages and more air, as if someone had cleared it out quickly, as if someone always expected company eventually. The padlocks were there for show. The latches hadn't been snapped. Maybe he liked being able to open them with a fingertip. Maybe he liked showing himself he could. There were papers upstairs. Not the sort of thing the news shows at 6, because there are rules. Police reports from long ago, copies that looked like someone had made them when the office was still using carbon paper, a clipping with no headline from a county over that talked about a trailer and a man, and the way people prefer to hear that the past is done. There were recipes, not written as recipes, not in any cookbook, but ratios and salts and how long something takes to stop being what it was and become something else. I never saw them. I only know the shape of what other people saw because I grew up among them, and we can make a story take a tight turn around the ugliest corners without stopping the car.
They didn't say her name at first, when they tried to assure us they were doing everything they could. They said the words you say to a town that has already started blaming itself. Eventually, there were remains that could be matched. Not all of her. Not enough of anything to give the family what a body gives, that final, ordinary kindness of weight. Enough to close one box and open 50 others with hinges none of us saw before. I went to school with her cousin. He stopped showing up. I didn't blame him. In the days between the search and the announcements, people came up with ways to make the facts fit inside their understanding of him. Some said he'd been a sweet old man and couldn't possibly have known what he was doing, as if age were a spotless sink that rinsed away history. Some said he'd always been odd, as if oddness were a map that had been there the whole time, if only we'd been better readers. A few said nothing at all, and kept their blinds closed. The men in uniform did the work decent men do when their job is to explain something that makes no sense, and then deliver paperwork to houses where breath doesn't come right anymore. When they took him away, he didn't fight. He didn't ask for a lawyer on the lawn like in the shows. He looked at the cameras and didn't look at any of us. He didn't look at me, anyway, though I was there, standing on the sidewalk with my hands in my pockets, because that's what you do when you need them not to shake. The cap was gone. His scalp was white where the sun hadn't touched it in decades. He looked smaller without the house around him. I thought about the basement, and the bulb humming, and the freezer fogging, and the way the padlock had hung like a theater prop. I thought about the afternoon my mother's voice crossed a block and found the soft parts of my name. I thought about the radio on his porch, and the soda sweating on the step, and the sentence about a man you'd ask to hold your ladder. There are parts of this that aren't mine to tell. I won't write what the papers finally wrote when the court filings made it possible, or what men with badges have to say when they line up and use the strong nouns to make each other feel like the world is holdable. I will say that when the house emptied, it did it slowly. People in boxes took away furniture. Volunteers scrubbed walls that weren't dirty. A cousin stood on the walk and signed things, and nodded, and didn't meet anyone's eyes. The maple kept shedding leaves. Someone took down the swing. The porch made a different sound after. I went away to school and came back and went away again, and still the line in my head remains clean between the day I stood beside that freezer and the day the cars pulled up with their lights off to be polite. Once, a few years later, a friend who writes asked me why I never wrote about it before. I told him the truth I have, that if I wrote it the wrong way, it would turn into the kind of story you read at 2 a.m. for a thrill and then send to someone with a skull emoji, that I couldn't stand that I didn't want to be the voice that turned a girl into copy and a neighbor into a Halloween mask. He nodded and said he understood, and then he asked me anyway to write it down because silence is a kind of permission, and because someone a block away might read it and realize there's a smell in the air they don't have a word for yet.
So here it is, plain as I can make it without painting the walls. A man I trusted with my spare key told me a story when I was small about his father walking into a place where the floor was covered in newspaper and a table didn't look like it belonged in a kitchen. He told it like a warning and like a prayer and like a way of making sure he wasn't carrying it alone. Years later, he invited me into a basement where the light shook and the air felt wrong and showed me a lid opening. And I didn't see what would have broken me to see because my mother called my name like an answer to a question I hadn't asked out loud. A month after that, a child went missing, and the work men do when there is nothing else to do led them to a house with a maple and a freezer and a notebook that had no right to exist. The truth stood up in front of all of us without costume and in broad daylight and asked us to say its name. We did, eventually, with the careful language the law uses when it needs to be both exact and bearable. It did not help the family, and it did not help me, and it did not help the part of town that still keeps its porch lights on 5 minutes longer than necessary. I used to think monsters announce themselves, that there's a posture to danger, a smell, a look, a kind of too much in the eyes you can learn and then check off like a safety course. I was a child, even after I wasn't, and children love rules because rules promise safety if you're clever and obedient. What I know now is that the worst thing in the world might keep a tidy porch, might lend you a wrench, might learn your birthday and ask after your mother's dog. It might be the man who hands you a cold soda and tells you a story as if stories are fences and not doors. Sometimes, when I'm back home and walk the dog past that lot where the maple still throws shade and the new owner keeps the hedges too neat, the air will tilt and I'll get the faintest echo of that winter smell, sweet and wrong, the one that once made the dog plant his feet. I don't pretend anymore that it could have been anything. I don't let myself make little safe houses out of paper and dates. I remember a lid rising and a hand not snapping a lock shut, and the weight of a palm on my shoulder guiding me up the stairs. I remember my mother's voice cutting through the heavy air of someone else's basement, and how ridiculous it is and how perfect that this is what saved me: dinner, and being called home on time. If you are hoping for something cleaner, I'm sorry, there isn't. He went where men go when you can finally name what they've done. People wore ties and said sentences built like brick walls. Some of the packages were matched to missing faces. Some weren't. A new family lives in his house. They painted the porch. They don't use the swing. When I pass and hear a radio, my stomach goes cold even if it's just the news about traffic on the freeway. I don't think I'll ever be the sort of person who stores much in a chest freezer. I label leftovers with the date, always, which is a confession and a vow, both. I keep more salt than a person needs, and sometimes I pour it down the drain for no reason other than to hear it whisper away. There's a version of this where I barged back down those steps a month before any of it and opened a lid and saw enough to make the phone call that would have rewritten the next weeks for everyone. That's not the version I get. The one I have is smaller and meaner. I saw almost nothing, and it was enough to turn my blood into a tuning fork. I walked away and told myself a story about good neighbors and venison and being polite. A girl did not come home, and men in patient voices came to our doors. And the house 2 doors down taught all of us what we never wanted to know. I still hear him sometimes when the radio goes to static between stations. The slow way he'd say, "He looked like anyone." He meant the man in the trailer, but he was telling me something about himself and didn't, or didn't want to, or couldn't. Maybe he thought if he kept the story in daylight, it would stay a story. Maybe he thought telling it would take out whatever spike it had driven into him as a boy. Maybe he liked the way it felt to be the only one who knew how the seams ran in our quiet town. It doesn't matter now. What matters is this: if you ever feel a hand light on your shoulder in a place where the air hums and the light shakes, listen for someone calling your name from far away. Listen hard. Go.